Hello and welcome back to Earthbeat Visions, a history of the future sound of London. Today we'll be looking at Lifeforms. Took me a while to get around to writing the original text for this entry. It's pretty daunting. After all, where can I even start writing about my favourite artistic work ever in any medium? Not just my favourite FSOL album or my favourite album in general, but my favourite thing created by humans. Still, here it is, Lifeforms. Release date 23rd of May 1994. There was no single defined recording block for the album. It's easy to imagine Brian and Garry signing to Virgin, recording Tales of Ephedrina as an introductory work, and then going to the studio every day for 10 months to do Lifeforms. But it wasn't that simple. Even discounting the numerous samples that date back to the band's time in Manchester, there are quite a few sounds taken from Brian's Z-Box tapes in there, there's still a title track originally delivered to Jumpin' and Pumpin' as a Yage piece called New Lifeforms at the start of 92, suggesting a late 91 recording date, and various environments which can be heard in their developmental stages over the course of the Kiss FM transmissions broadcast between September 92 and November 93. And the album was apparently changed at the last minute according to Brian in a Melody Maker interview. We sampled one note off a Daniel Lanois record, and even though we thought we had clearance, the night before the cut we got a call saying he didn't want us to use it. I guess the radio shows have been quite instrumental in building up that sort of flow of consciousness feel, Garry told Radioactive when discussing the album, and it's easy to hear that in the record structure, feeling considerably less track-oriented than Tales and generally far more ambient. The move of focus away from tracks is something the band spoke about regularly. Our idea was to try and lose our egos, and if we'd written a track that lasted 5 minutes but got boring after 30 seconds, then just use 30 seconds of it and then go into something else, so it was a completely non-linear listening experience, is how Garry put it at the time. The concept of singles was even less interesting to them, with Cobain telling Sound on Sound the philosophy behind the album was, okay, drop the beat and drop the bass and let's return to serious albums that aren't based around hit singles. And it's true, there are no singles on Lifeforms. Okay, so 2 singles were released to promote the album, but both were so radically different from their album counterparts that they might as well have been different entities entirely. While the radio shows might have paved the way for Lifeforms, albeit in an even less obviously structured form than the album, they also acted as a preview for the material itself. Indeed, by the time of its release, 16 of the 19 tracks on Lifeforms had already been broadcast on one of the group's radio transmissions, albeit only as brief intro environments in the case of Illflower and Omnipresence. What's even more fascinating is just how confident they were in the chosen material itself. Only 7 tracks from the various Lifeforms era radio shows ended up not being included on the album. Open Enclosure, Abandon Incoming, Stomach Acid, Deep Into Your Subconscious I Slide, the untitled track from the Lifeforms VHS, Slowly Falling Backwards, Kai and Dirty Shadows, the latter 2 eventually ending up on ISDN anyway. So regardless of how busy they were in the studio, they had an ear for their favourite tracks from the start. Pretty remarkable given the clear number of pieces from that era that ended up on the From the Archives series. The focus and dedication to the right tracks paid off, of course, helping explain why the album is so consistent with no real weak points. The record notoriously went through several versions too, regularly being updated. Early mixes featured different running orders and were generally a lot shorter, the first couple running to just 11 or 12 tracks. By the time the final cut came out, the album ran to 90 minutes and 19 tracks, earning a place alongside The Orb's Adventures Beyond the Ultraworld and Selected Ambient Works Volume 2 in the Classic 90s Ambient Double Albums category. The delays acted as forerunners to the kind of wait fans will become used to in the post-Dead Cities era, with Mixmag announcing in November 93 that the album was due for release the following January, which was at least slightly more realistic than Future Sound of London album September 93 as mentioned in the Tales of Ephedrina press release. Still, for those who hadn't been following the group's various radio exploits, or had maybe only been able to catch the frip-coated Essential Mix transmission, all this information was simply background noise to the 1.5 hours of new FSOL music, and how utterly new it must have sounded. Other than perhaps Mountain Goat, everything the group had released on Virgin to this point had still been largely beat-based, even the single version of Cascade, and so the album's contents and their lack of straightforward beats would have been an eye-opening experience to many listeners. Opening on the album version of Cascade, a stripped-back ethereal spectre of its energetic 6-part cousin released the previous autumn, Listeners have to wait for track 5, the Jumpin' and Pumpin' era title track, before coming across anything remotely resembling a dance beat. And while the second disc does feature a run of breakbeat sampling pieces in the middle, they're still outnumbered by more downbeat fare. 6 tracks on the album feature no rhythmic elements at all, and a further 7 feature beats that are either very slow or oddly staggered. Lifeforms is not an album for dancing or head nodding or blasting in your car, and in many ways feels as big a step on from Tales of Ephedrina as that album did from Accelerator. For those who might have been expecting something in the same ballpark as their debut, the album will have come as a huge shock, for Lifeforms is, in essence, an ambient album. Ambient has become a problematic word over the years, having deviated far from Eno's initial 1978 definition, and eventually became a catch-all term for either music without a beat or anything atmospheric. The 90s version of ambient, or ambient house as the KLF defined it on the press release for their seminal album Chill Out, tended to exist as an alternative to rave music. Many dance music staples can be found on those sorts of albums, breakbeats and four-to-the-floor drum machines, albeit usually playing second fiddle to the melodic aspects, trance-like synth sequences, dub bass lines, spoken samples either from sci-fi films or lectures on psychedelic drugs, field recordings, usually of rain, birdsong and crashing waves. I have an entire series about this era of music called The Rise and Fall of the Chill Out Room, a history of ambient house and ambient techno from 89 to 96 that I'm sure many of you have seen on my YouTube channel. While Lifeforms features a number of these tropes, it's the ones that it misses that mark it out as a very different album to most of its contemporaries. The movie dialogue that peppers the band's transmissions is largely absent from the album, and the small sections that appear are a long way from any peace and love psychedelic platitudes, instead being incredibly creepy. They Were Drowning Me, a key example. While there is some subtle dub influence on the deep sub-bass lines on many tracks, the Orb and Bill Laswell style homage approach is completely absent, as are the Berlin School synth sequences that defined so many albums at the time. Indeed, the one thing that sets this era of FSOL apart from almost all their contemporaries is the way the tracks are constructed. The majority of sounds you hear on Lifeforms are samples. Brian and Garry's sampling skills have been developing since 1990, with an increasing number of strange and identifiable sounds being used liberally throughout their tracks. But on Lifeforms they become almost the entire focus of the music. These aren't simply cut and paste loops like on AST, but sounds gathered from a huge range of sources, heavily fucked around with and used as raw material to construct entirely new pieces of music from. As well as an agreement with DJs which allowed them to sample from all sorts of new and unusual records, they also spent many hours recording from TV and video, sampling documentary soundtracks, snippets from wildlife programmes, obscure movies. And while a lot of these samples have been tracked down by diligent fans over the years, a full sample database will always be impossible because there's a fair amount of bespoke material in there too, recorded by session musicians. We'd get them in, pay them £50 and tell them to play like Miles Davis in his experimental phase for half hour, and we'd leave the tape running and go out, Garry told Future Music in 2014 on the 20th anniversary of the album. The phrase used to describe this never-ending search for new sound was inert armchair sampling, based around the idea that one could make an entire album out of sounds gathered sat at home watching the telly. Some of the most obvious samples were cleared. Osric Tentacles, Klaus Schultz and Robert Fripp are among those credited on the sleeve, but most were small and obscure enough to get away with using. Indeed, single-shot samples were frequently used to turn the most mundane synth sequence into something strange. In Garry's words, a lot of the time we'll just write a crap sequence, the first thing that comes into your head, then fiddle around with it to make it sound good. You'll start with a really cheesy piano sound and then put weird sample in its place. Only 2 guest musicians are credited. Future Mercury Music Prize winner Talvin Singh for playing tabla, and Curve vocalist Tony Halliday. The heavy use of sampling is what gives the band's Virgin era albums their unique sound, and makes them sound so strange and frequently unsettling. Whereas much of the aforementioned 90s ambient music fell dangerously close to New Age, Lifeforms constantly reaffirms its weirdness, with tracks branching off into strange directions, utterly alien-sounding samples splurging out of nowhere, and sections coming to abrupt halts. In an era defined by 18-minute immersive studio jams, Brian and Garry were uniquely unafraid to look at the big picture and use elements for as long as they were required to suit the full album, rather than focusing on tracks as individual listening blocks. Whenever things seem to get too comfortable, there's always a sting in the tail to keep the listener on their toes. Dead Skin Cell's gentle acoustic outro is followed by the menacing title track. Domain is 3 minutes of blissful classical ambience with an insidious discord buried in the final few seconds. Between the changes of tone and the utterly bizarre sounds, the very final noise on the album is so wonderfully indescribable, FSOL managed to create a truly surreal sound world, which it appears was their game plan all along. Not inspired by the orb's spacey leanings or pastoral serenity, the only theme is what Garry often refers to as brutal realism or brutal reality. "It's not a question of going to outer space," he told The Wire. "I don't need to go to outer space, here is weird enough." Rejecting the notion of musical gatherings, Brian and Garry instead locked themselves in Earthbeat and used a sense of isolation to turn their focus on just how they considered that Earth itself is a very strange place indeed. Of course, this isn't necessarily what fans heard when listening to the album. As with all abstract music, there's a fair amount of variety in people's interpretations, with some believing it to be reminiscent of alien landscapes. However, a very frequent version of the album's theme is one of tropical or exotic landscapes, something that matches a fair amount of the artwork too. For me, the first disc feels more open, much more like a desert, while the second heads into savanna and jungle territory. Whatever the imagery, the album does an incredibly good job of sounding utterly organic and avoiding the cliché of electronic music sounding like machines. It's a staggering work, wonderfully described by Garry as a deep, immersive, emotional world. World is an excellent word for it, as not only is it hugely atmospheric and organic, but there are numerous repeated sounds throughout, especially on the first disc. Illflower and Lifeform Ends, for example, are both effectively remixes of Lifeforms, while Cascade's opening environment is a preview of Flak. Similarly, there are several samples that appear on a number of different tracks. Environments are given room to breathe here, with many of them lasting well over a minute, and 2 listed as separate tracks of their own, Birdwings and Interstat. The artwork finds Boogie and the band taking a further step on from the Tales experiments of the previous year. The front cover is one of 2 iconic images from this era that have gone on to define the visual side of the band. It depicts a young Asian girl standing in front of a rocky structure with her hand outstretched, a sea anemone floating above it. Although it's a collage of 3 totally separate images, it's seamless and thus marks the first FSOL cover without any overt digital imagery, matching the music's organic quality and making it stand out against the basic CG that adorned the sleeves of most 90s electronic albums. Virgin's investment was clearly paying dividends. It's a mysterious image that immediately tells you the music contained within is not going to be conventional. The entire image, with the model Shawneen Tarr shown in full, was created by Boogie, but later cropped down by Brian to become the album cover you see now. Purportedly, the band attempted to charge Virgin Records £150,000 for the cover, claiming it to be a work of art. I spoke to Rob Manley about this recently, and he said that's a very silly story. Clearly another one of the largely made-up ones that come from the band's 90s interviews. The image found in the middle of the CD booklet and the inside of the gatefold vinyl is almost as famous, featuring the same girl in a similar pose, this time holding a jellyfish and standing in front of a vast landscape accompanied by the Spike model. The first shiny brown version of Spiky, as seen on the Cascade cover, has been developed here into its more famous grey form, with a more detailed skin-like texture. Instead of simply floating there, its tentacles are effectively seen punching holes into the fabric of reality, creating wormholes in the canyon walls and the sky itself, a truly surreal image that can only have come from a hugely imaginative mind. Probably Boogie's, given that he designed the creature in the first place. The 3D modelling itself was again created by Olaf Wendt. Shawneen Tarr has gone on to become part of the band's visual presence. She was a model at the time, and she's listed as a co-conspirator on the old EBV website. Far from being disturbed by the strangeness she was invited to join in on, Tarr reportedly got along well with the band and even visited them many years later. She later gave up modelling to become a professional footballer in America. Fans sometimes refer to her as the Witch Girl, much like Spiky has earned the nickname the Electronic Brain. This image is astonishingly well rendered for 1994, another example of how much Virgin money must have gone into the Earthbeat graphics computers, although the wormhole in Shawneen's hand is a weak spot. The back cover features a return of the sea anemone from the front, floating over a cracked desert surface, red clouds floating ominously in the background. A further Boogie image entitled Desert Frontiers can be found inside, with a grounded Spiky sat on a rocky landscape next to a raging river. The remaining imagery seems to be by the band itself, and lacks some of the finesse of Boogie's collages. Incidental Girl x9 is one of Garry's, featuring 9 odd naked figures in various colours. Electronic Storage and Retrieval is a blurred band shot with a range of fractured digital imagery behind. Photo Collage Private Collection is a collage of photos by Brian of himself, Garry, their studio gear and a cat, with various colour filters. The CD booklet only Pavement Psychology has a colour inverted image of Spiky, as well as a man in a wheelchair and another figure in shorts, a photograph taken by Garry on holiday. None of these images especially adds to the desert imagery put together by Buggy, but they do add to the completely in-house DIY approach the band have always adopted. That said, Buggy's imagery is largely collected from photographs purchased from photo libraries. At this time, he and the band hadn't travelled. The use of titles for all the images suggests ideas of grandeur. The group's boldness at the time had them desiring it to be seen as high art. I quite like it. It's fucking cheeky, but given the scope and success of the album, I think they deserve to be cheeky. Beneath the disc tray and on one side of the LP2 sleeve is a row of album covers that inadvertently fueled rumours for 13 years, as well as shaping many future releases. It advertises the group's past discography, or at least a heavily edited version, with thumbnails of the Papua New Guinea, Accelerator, Tales of Ephedrina and Cascade front covers, as well as a fifth image, a black square acting as the cover for a forthcoming amorphous androgynous album entitled Environments. This image, as well as a supposed track from the album released on a compilation, were all fans had to go on when contemplating the mystery album. But that's a story for another day. The cassette features a fold-out 6-panel J-card with a montage of most of the imagery. Credit-wise, Lifeforms sees things back to normal after the Philip Pin directing on Tales. On the rear cover, each track is listed in its own cell, with unusual characters used to denote additional writers in the credits section. I've always been fond of this format, although the cells being different sizes makes my teeth itch. The EBV logo is present on the back cover, as well as the band's PO box for anyone wanting to send fan mail or demos. Apparently they received many. The album's entire text features the first use of the band's signature font, Eurostyle Extended, here in its bold format. Unusually, the spine of all three physical formats just lists the artist name without the album title, and the 2LP version lists the band name simply as Future Sound of London without a the. The cover itself features no text, and the album title is included as a sticker on the CD and 2LP versions and in the framing on the cassette art. Released almost exactly 2 years after Papua New Guinea was in the charts, Lifeforms was finally the album Virgin had been waiting for, and they marketed it suitably. Magazines were a prime target for adverts as well as radio, a promo CD featuring 5 extracts of album tracks was issued, and of course the band's ongoing ISDN tour brought in listeners. Nevertheless, despite very little broad commercial exposure, 7 months after its lead single, the album managed to chart at number 6 in the UK and stayed in the top 100 for 8 weeks. Even by mid-90s standards, it was an incredible feat for an album as truly strange and obscure sounding as Lifeforms to peak inside the top 10. Incredibly, the midweek sales chart had it at number 1. Despite the band's stubbornly independent stance and lack of interest in creating commercial music, Virgin's gamble had paid off, and the Future Sound of London's surreal, brutal realist ambient music became one of the best-selling albums of the week on release. A few weeks later, a short film to accompany the album was released on VHS, more on that in the next video, and the band continued broadcasting ISDN transmissions over the following weeks. The CD edition has been in print ever since release, and in January 2018, the 2LP version finally received a long overdue repressing. In 2024, to mark the album's 30th anniversary, Universal put it out again as a 2LP green vinyl version. I remember looking at FSOL's albums in my local indie at the age of 12 and wondering just what they'd sound like. Having always had an overactive imagination and being of the persuasion that the best music conjures images in the listener's head, I'll take album art quite seriously. As I leafed through the Lifeforms booklet for probably the 20th time, £17.99 was simply out of my price range at that point, I began to piece together a story. Pavement Psychology with its inverted colours looked like it had a scientist in a lab coat with Spiky next to him, breaking a glass screen and bursting out of confinement. The creature was clearly a scientific experiment gone wrong, and the gatefold image was it beginning to wreak havoc on the world, punching holes in reality. Don't think I ever really worked out what Shaunene's role was in things, but she clearly was important. Sounds a bit silly now, but I was convinced that this was really what was happening in the art. I've always been very keen on programme music and the album art adding to it, so that's what the album was to me even before I heard it. My first listen of Lifeforms was one of confusion. Even having already bought Dead Cities and expecting something as similarly dense and joined together, I wasn't prepared for just how much of it there was and how much of that was going to be environments. My friend Jack often talks about albums having a geography, and I think that's especially true here. I've always felt that listening to Lifeforms is like exploring an actual place, with various samples and environments acting as signposts. As an impatient kid, I was prone to skipping through tracks a lot until I got to grips with each piece and could begin to understand the album as a whole, and for a couple of weeks it really felt like I'd been left somewhere I'd never been before, miles from home, and had to find my way through this landscape by myself. It was a truly overwhelming experience. But as time went on, I began to grow more confident and started listening to the album start to finish, getting to know it intimately, imagining the landscapes it was suggesting. In some ways, I wish I could forget the album and be able to listen to it with totally fresh ears again. In others, I don't think I could ever recapture the experience of listening to Lifeforms with such wide-eyed imagination and musical naivety as I did in my pre-teen years. I made a tape copy for the car which accompanied my dad and I on numerous day trips, working as a soundtrack to the passing countryside. I don't listen to it very often these days because I feel like I know just about every element of it well, and familiarity breeds contempt. But on the occasion I do put it on and listen to it properly, I'm still sometimes transported back to my youth, experiencing the magic of this truly original, awe-inspiring music. Well, there we go. I don't think I've even remotely done the album justice, but if I didn't try, then the series would have come to a standstill. On to the individual tracks. Cascade. Lifeforms begins in very much the same way as Tales of Ephedrina, with a minute-long environment. Of course, by this time the band had moved away from publicly naming their environment, so the opening minute of Cascade is generally just referred to simply as Cascade Environment. The section itself dates back to at least early '93 and was indeed the second bit of Lifeforms to be broadcast, opening the first Kiss transmission. Despite not being broadcast until November '93, after the single's release, the album version is in fact the original mix, reworked for the single much later, placing its inception to the late '92, early '93 period. The opening environment is more dense and atmospheric than anything on Tales, sampling the Osric Tentacles track, Agog in the Ether, which would also be used on Flat, 2 tracks down. Among deep bass thumps and layers of ethnic sounding percussion are snippets of flute and vocals, gongs and synth squelches, giving the piece, and the album, an exotic feel from the off. Once the main track begins, the mood becomes lighter and possibly more chilly. Fans expecting the single version would have been in for a huge surprise. Lacking the breaks, the koto melody, the flute motifs and synth sequences, Cascade is an almost skeletal piece based around light, skittering drum machine lines and drifting synth chords. The vocal and xylophone samples, only featured occasionally in the single version, take the lead here. If the single version is very much in the sound of a raging river, the album mix is similarly aquatic but closer to a small, slow-moving stream. Structurally, Cascade finds Brian and Garry continuing to explore their non-linear ideas, and although essentially built around loops, it's remarkably unrepetitive. The rhythm track swings back and forth between various elements, building up and down and introducing new parts at various points. In the second half, the energy even picks up with a brief breakbeat and gong section for 24 bars. As ever, all sorts of sounds rumble beneath the surface, including various kinds of bubbling, squelching synths, and the occasional burst of what I always thought was gunfire. It may sound like a simplistic track, but a closer listen reveals lots going on at all times. As the opening track of Lifeforms, it's quite hard to consider Cascade on its own merits. It's inextricably connected with being the start of an incredible album, the first step on a musical journey. Despite the watery imagery associated with the track, if anything it's always suggested flying or floating to me, and the visuals I associate with the track are of soaring above the landscape seen in the album's gatefold artwork, albeit without the somewhat disturbing presence of Shawneen and Spikey. Because for all its minor chords, it's a gentle piece of music, and that's the big takeaway here. After Tales and the Cascade single and their chunky breakbeats, Lifeforms opens on something a million miles away from the dance floor. Illflower. After the somewhat serene Cascade, Illflower introduces the darker side of Lifeforms. It's an unusually structured track, even for FSOL, in 3 different sections. The first 40 seconds are an environment opening with a foghorn and deep rumbling synth pulses, followed by the You Will Awake Now sample as used throughout the Kiss FM transmissions, albeit slowed right down. I always used to think this said It Was a Way to the Sky, and I've used that as a track title myself. The environment is the only part to feature on a transmission, first appearing on the final Kiss FM show. This then leads into my favourite part of the track, a section that makes Illflower the first in a trilogy of related pieces, followed later by Lifeforms and Lifeform Ends. Utilising the striking two-note melody of those tracks over suspended choir-like synth chords, it's an airy section, stunningly atmospheric, and a wonderful foreshadowing of things to come. The final minute introduces a new organ-like synth that adds grander and darker feel to the piece, before a shuddering kick drum cuts the track off in full flow, ending in a truly bizarre environment, an almost amusingly wobbly all-over-the-place synth line, human voices, and a strange metallic sound which I always imagined to be tin cans on sticks on the edge of a tribal village. Don't ask. Not only does Illflower introduce a melodic theme reused throughout the album, but it includes a large number of samples that would find their way onto several tracks from the album and the Lifeforms EP. They are very hard to identify, but give the idea that they were maybe taken from a documentary, some very jungle-like noises, one which might be an elephant, and unidentified human voices. The track also reaffirms Cascade's message: this is not a dance album. With no beats or bass lines at all and barely any sense of rhythm in the whole piece, it's pure ambience, melody, atmosphere and texture. Illflower is a wonderfully off-kilter title that offers strange imagery but no explanation. It appears to be rooted in a vocal sample used in the otherwise unrelated Still Flowers. Flak. Flak feels like Lifeforms stepping up a gear. After a pair of very subdued opening tracks, it starts with a steady kick drum. In fact, it's the same kick as used in Cascade's opening environment. Much in the way Illflower shares elements with Lifeforms and all its variations, then Cascade's environment and Flak feel interconnected too, and they may well have grown from each other in the creative process. The flute and vocal sample from Osric Tentacles' Agog in the Ether are here again, as well as the bells and other percussive elements from the environment. The Osrics were a favourite band of Nick Philpin, manager of the building Earthbeat was in and source of the Philip Pin alias, and their regular appearance on his stereo led to the use of sampling. Being very much industry outsiders, they were totally open to use of sampling without payment. Garry recalls them only asking for a copy of Cobain in return, which is duly bought for them, although the Dead Cities credits suggest it was the sample on My Kingdom that was swapped for the software. They aren't the only artists credited for samples. A very brief snippet of Robert Fripp's guitar from his Peter Gabriel collaboration Here Comes the Flood is also mentioned, and most notably, two pieces from 1986 library music album Atmospheric Elements Weather. While FSOL tracks are notoriously crammed with samples, the band seemingly preferring them to synths throughout much of their Virgin era, very few are credited. However, when used quite as conspicuously as Paul Williams' Andrew Grossart's Shining Ice and William Thompson and Trevor Nightingale's Cloud Formations, it's unsurprising that those musicians get co-writing credits. Shining Ice provides the track's main melodic hook, while Cloud Formations is the source of the brief counter melody first heard around the 1 minute mark. In these later cases, it seems like a publishing credit was requested rather than a direct license of the audio, leading to 7 songwriters being responsible for the track. Despite having a heavier focus on beats than its two predecessors, Flak is still very much in the ambient house territory. The rhythm is oddly staggered, just 2 kicks at the start of each bar, with samples of who knows what used as percussion. Still, the beats, combined with major key melodies, give the track a more uplifting feel after the opening 2 pieces. Structurally, it's typical FSOL fare, 3 differing main sections with a one-time only mid-section, and a very brief breakdown where the kick drum seems to go haywire. One of the things that makes their music so fascinating is the lack of long repetitive tracks that most electronic music relies on. Just when you've got a handle on a piece, it veers off into a very different territory. There's also a nice bit of foreshadowing in the middle, with a brief wind sample snippet that returns at the end as a segue into its main use in the following track. It's these little moments that make Lifeforms feel like such a singular music world. As a title, Flak is an odd one. Referring in this case to taking criticism or blame, it seems to be totally unrelated to the uplifting music and simply a word the band liked at the time. I've always imagined it to soundtrack being among tall grasses and plants. Birdwings. A rare example of an environment being given its own indexing and title, Birdwings is a brief interlude between 2 big melodic tracks. Picking up that wind sound from the end of Flak and then running with it, the track finds the mood of the album lifting off the ground and up into the air, soaring above things once more. 3 background sections exist: the opening wind, a mid-section of reverb-heavy electronic samples, and a closing 20 seconds with bird calls and rainfall. On top of this is the source of the title. The mics were set up under the pigeon's nest outside the studio door. The pigeons were inert in the cosy heat. Josh with the dreads threw a fag packet at them and suddenly they sprang into life. Yage immediately fed it through the machines, pitching it into an awesome swoosh of flapping wings. The pigeon sample was slowed down into the huge clattering percussive noise that adorns the track, and Josh with the Dreads was in fact Josh Wink, later to find fame with Higher State of Consciousness. The quote comes from the old EBV website with its Lifeforms glossary helpfully explaining some of the track titles. A typically self-critical explanation to The Wire found Garry describing it as a re-evaluation of your own space. We play games within our space, it's like an electronic form of masturbation. The Lifeforms glossary was usefully reprinted in one of the Ramblings of the Madman books. There's a brief flute sample near the end that always brings to mind primitive cave art to me, and I've no idea why. It reappears later in Eggshell, adding to the album's recurring musical language. The track even begins with a reversed version of the tinkling bells used in Flak and Cascade environment. Operating as an environment in itself, Birdwings appeared on many transmissions, first broadcast in November 93 on KISS Transmission 3, and even turning up on the otherwise Lifeforms 3 New York transmission, and most surprisingly the very first Monstrous Psychedelic Bubble mix. Its appearance on the 1993 Essential mix had it down as an environment from the Amorphous Androgynous album of that title, suggesting it was a fairly late addition to Lifeforms. Dead Skin Cells. Opening with the rain from the end of Birdwings, a sharp note, a horn, a synth, who knows, introduces a beautiful piano melody, and we're straight into fan favourite Dead Skin Cells. Brian and Garry's music is frequently evocative, often strange, many times beautiful, but Dead Skin Cells is an overwhelmingly emotional track in a very human way that doesn't feature all that often in the group's 90s releases. The looping piano melody and descending synth chords, combined with the reverb-soaked drums and field recordings, draw the piece in an almost new age direction, something less unfashionable now than in 1994 admittedly, but the track is never schlocky, with a genuine aching beauty present throughout, and of course plenty of bizarre samples thrown in to keep the ever so well weirdness present. The piano melody and drums being in different time signatures subconsciously adds an off-kilter feel. Nighttime insects feature heavily in the piece, giving it a heavily nocturnal mood, which reflects the tone of the music perfectly. A gradually descending conga loop in the middle is a lovely surreal touch. As the main theme fades away, a secondary melody appears to form an outro environment played on an acoustic guitar. A couple of brief synth sweeps keep things textural, which also later appear on Lifeform Ends. The track was first broadcast on the third KISS FM transmission, but during the 3D Headspace tour was largely truncated to its brief appearance on the Lifeforms AV soundtrack. The title comes from a recurring theme in the band's mythos, described on the EBV site as 2 years of personal flaking and the room became known as the Room of Dead Skin Cells. Pin used to say, "I'm getting up my nose." Yage would say, "Chop me a line out of you." The unpleasantness of that expanded upon to Mixmag and future music as the kind of sordid things people don't really talk about that our album is about, and the track names weren't fanciful names of escapism, and that's what's interesting about them. Has to be fair, for all the nocturnal exotic imagery the piece conjures in my mind, piles of dead skin lying about in Earthbeat isn't one of them. The title was originally used for a 1992 track, a possible contender for Tales of Everdrina that was eventually released as Tokyo Travel. It's also rumoured that this track evolved from that piece. Lifeforms. The title track of Lifeforms, bizarrely, is the oldest piece on the album. Recorded during the band's tenure with Jumpin' and Pumpin' in late 91, delivered to the label as part of a Yage EP entitled New Lifeforms and rejected for being too weird, Lifeforms is a real oddity. For a start, it's not only the first track on the album to feature a fall-to-the-floor kick, but the only one, and one of only a handful released during the pair's time recording for Virgin. It's also very, very different to anything released during the Jumpin' and Pumpin' years. The kick drum is still comparatively subdued, and the whole thing is densely layered in a way later Jumpin' and Pumpin' releases didn't come close to. It's perhaps unsurprising that the dance label were wary. The link from Dead Skin Cells is the briefest of crossfades, allowing for a side change on the vinyl edition of the album. This means the second side kicks off with a powerful track. Lifeforms is a dark, sinister piece. A couple of conga-esque loops, some organ chords and a wailing wordless vocal open the track before that kick drum comes in. It's never adjoined by the expected hat snare loop to enter proper techno territory, and indeed the track very quickly breaks down into less dense textures. The main two chords guide the track throughout, but otherwise it's typically complex with various sections coming and going, elements regularly recombined into new textural layers, completely new parts appearing. What I think of as the elephant sample doesn't appear until well over 3 minutes in. Just when you're expecting a climax, the track breaks apart into a muffled underwater version of itself and peacefully fades away into nothing. It's still quite remarkable to think how early this track came along. This was recorded before people living today. Despite being initially rejected, it's clear Brian and Garry were aware of the piece's strength, and they returned to it numerous times, it opening their very first radio transmission in '92 and appearing on their first Peel session around the same time. Not only did it go on to be the title track of the band's first proper Virgin album, but they went on to rework it numerous times, both on the album, in ambient form as Ill Flower and a brighter reprise as Lifeform Ends, but also in numerous paths on the Lifeforms single. The album version appears on the single as Path 3. On the Lifeforms single promo, the track is referred to as Album Mix and includes no outro environment. On Lifeforms extracts, the album version environment is swiftly faded out. Eggshell. Eggshell's initial environment is somewhat at odds with the rest of the track, a piece of grand-scale ambient music that alone sums up the album's epic scale in a few minutes. Synth strings and a plucked melody introduce the main theme before a pair of catchy and evocative squelchy synth melodies come in. Eggshell is the rare example of synths playing a big part in a track at this point in the group's career, and although there are plenty of samples in there, that ethnic sounding plucked melody is based on a one-shot sample of some sort, these sweeping synths had a refreshing textural change 7 tracks into the album. Much like Cascade, the track is rhythmic, but only relying on the lightest of beats. In this case, a single hi-hat line and a looped grandfather clock sample recalling Global Communications' epic 1431. The main track cuts out abruptly before the 5-minute mark to be replaced by a synth reprise that builds up to a stunning climax, a real highlight of the album. The light touch to the rhythm section, despite its deep dubby bass, makes it another of those floaty tracks, one that makes me think, perhaps unsurprisingly given its scope, of being high up overlooking some grand vista or other. As with much of Lifeforms, recurring sounds suggest a particular set of samples used, and quite possibly a similar recording time for this and Birdwings, both of which feature a flute sample, the one that always makes me think of primitive cave paintings, and even the sharp note that follows Birdwings straight into dead skin cells. Both Birdwings and Eggshell were premiered on the third Kiss FM transmission. There were plans to release Eggshell as a third single from Lifeforms, and the release was even given Virgin and Astral Work catalogue numbers, VSCDT 1520, ASW 6140. 1994 was a busy year for the band, however, and with the delayed release of the Lifeforms single, the expected release of Environments, eventually to be replaced by ISDN, the single was scrapped. Nobody knows what was due to be on it, although it's quite possible Climbing was part of the sessions. The track was later heavily reworked as Globular, a 5.1 piece used at the Lifeforms exhibition at the Connecticut Museum in 2006. The title comes from a phrase used in the studio at the time and is one of many Riley's self-critical track names from the era. "I'm sick of tiptoeing on the eggshells that surround you," Pin spluttered to Yage, referring to his increasingly eggshell ego inside the fragile eggshell mind. Among Myselves. The environment that links Eggshells with Among Myselves is one of the strangest on Lifeforms, and one that reminds me of some of the stranger environments on Tales of Ephedrina. It's undoubtedly very organic, but totally indescribable. Are there weird animals buzzing around in there? Strange human voices? Who knows? An utter marvel and a testament to the band's wonderful sound design skills. The environment that follows is possibly the most widely referenced in the band's catalogue, and it's just a hugely memorable one in its own right. Sampling dialogue from the David Cronenberg horror film Scanners, I Can Hear Myself, I Think I'm a Bit Afraid They Were Drowning Me, as well as electronic beeps from the film, more unidentified organic background sounds, and of course the huge ear-shattering fart from Brian's EMS Synthie AKS, it's a tour de force of utter weirdness and atmosphere building. I remember first listening to this and just wondering what the hell was going on. What could the man possibly be talking about? Who were drowning him? What the bejesus was that noise? It's an iconic moment in the FSOL catalogue. I always associated the female laughter after the Synthie blast with some malevolent women drowning the man. It's quite remarkable then that the main track itself is far less disturbing and violent than the 2 minutes that precede it. Among Myselves, with its bright synth melody, bouncy rhythm caked in dubby delays and spacious field recordings, is one of the most uplifting pieces on Lifeforms. It's quite bizarre to find it sandwiched between two harrowing environments. But then again, that's FSOL for you. And of course the EMS squelch makes it utterly impossible to fall asleep to the album. As the main track fades away, a brief snatch of electric guitar appears, and then the album returns to its start, with the sub-bass rumbles and harsh synth squelches that form part of Cascade's opening environment at the very start of the album, disc 1 of Lifeforms ending in Symmetry. The The river field recording in the opening environment and the watery sound of the main synth lead always give this track a very aquatic feel to me, and in my head it soundtracks the Desert Frontiers waterfall spiky collage on the album's inlay. The brief spoken snippets used in the track, actually NASA recordings of astronauts on Apollo 11, were always military voices speaking over radios to me. Lifeforms, for all its natural imagery, has a sinister human presence in my own internal interpretation, and these are soldiers hiding in trees overlooking the river. What are they looking for? Who knows? Maybe Spiky. He has, after all, just escaped from an experimental laboratory. Okay, I'm getting carried away here. Title-wise, the EBV site has a nice explanation. Another failed explanation by Yage. He wasn't unduly concerned, he looked up. I'll keep it among myself. Garry's later description of it being about the rationalisation of our own schizophrenia rings slightly less true. The opening environment was broadcast in May '93 on the second Kiss FM transmission. The main part of the track remained unheard by public ears until the 1994 Essential Mix with Robert Fripp, broadcast shortly before the album's release. And with that, the first half of Lifeforms concludes, and there's a brief pause before the journey takes on a somewhat different tone. Domain. After some slightly more rhythm-heavy tracks in the second half of Disc 1, Lifeforms returns to pure ambient territory for the start of its second run. Domain begins with wind, thematically tying it to tracks like Birdwings on the first disc, before a melody fades in. Interestingly, it's an interpolation of Johann Pachelbel's Canon in D major, a famous Baroque-era piece for strings, one of Brian's favourite pieces. The use of a piece of classical music, especially an almost saccharine piece like the Canon, is quite an unusual choice for FSOL, but it does work. It sounds like it's being played on a warm synth pad, although it could possibly be a heavily filtered recording of a string quartet. Occasional saturated synth notes appear on top before more field recordings gradually overtake the music, at first crashing waves, then several others, including people talking, bells and jungle sounds. As the main theme fades away, the track remains with the jungle sample, and a very subtle discord appears underneath, signifying a change in mood and a suggestion of a tonal shift for the remainder of the album. As with much of the record, the track was premiered on the third Kiss FM transmission in late '93, its only known appearance on a radio broadcast. Spineless Jelly. Picking up from Domain with the sinister jungle atmosphere, Spineless Jelly heads into a cacophony of sound, including an almost hidden reappearance of the steam train from the outro of Lifeforms, as a chilling synth sequence marches in. A secondary synth line follows, and the mood moves from creepy into truly nightmarish. At this point in their career, Spineless Jelly is by far the darkest sounding track the band had released. A stripped back mid-section with some shuddering reverse noises and a spoken sample mysteriously announcing 7-6 breaks things up, before a mechanical drum machine fades in and the synth pulses return. A coda featuring sinister piano notes and an oddly looping sample round out the unusual track. It stands out on Lifeforms for several reasons. It's an oddly repetitive piece, and all the better for it, on an album notable for its intricate structures. It's very heavily synth-based with relatively few discernible samples, and it's the only full track from the album never to appear on a transmission in any form, the only other unbroadcast Lifeforms tracks being the Brief Environment Interstat and Lifeform Ends, an alternative version of the frequently appearing Lifeforms Path 5. The title, described as a weak-willed person, term used for Pin periodically in the Lifeforms glossary, is one of many wonderful self-deprecating in-jokes to emerge from Earthbeat in the form of track names. In stark contrast, the surreal and harrowing mood to this piece always perfectly match the gatefold image with Shawneen and Spiky and a subtly vast apocalyptic feel. Interstat. A Brief Environment given its own index and title, Interstat is one of the shortest tracks in the FSOL canon and by far the shortest released in the 90s. The woman announces the title, followed by growling synths, utterly strange slowed down samples and unsettling floaty synth chords, and then it's all over. It's unusually sci-fi feeling with less of the organic, natural feel of Lifeforms, reminding us that the album is thematically more complex than often assumed. Unusually, the track acting as an environment, it never actually appeared on a transmission. The title is similar to the unreleased humanoid track Intelstat, suggesting the two may share a vocal sample or even more elements. Vertical Pig. Vertical Pig is largely of akin with Spineless Jelly when it comes to mood. This is a dark, aggressive piece of music. It doesn't start that way, however. A glorious minute-long environment opens the track with an uplifting flute motif, warm synth sequences and a welcoming river field recording. I always imagine being on a savannah as the sun comes up, animals drinking at the river. Eventually, helicopter sounds come in, the disruptive human element again, and the main track starts. Wailing sounds and synth chords descend into unseen depths. All manner of rumbling, bubbling noises burst up from the mire, the sample library spewing forth its most unsettling snippets at seemingly random intervals. The violent, plodding beats are similarly made from difficult to identify samples rather than traditional drums. Every once in a while the whole thing stops to let unearthly bubbles of sound take over, only for the bulk of the track to return full force a few seconds later. It's an unrelenting, genuinely scary piece of music. The title is no less unsavoury than the music. Described as initially a book started in the mid-80s by Pin, this refers to experiments conducted with transplanting pigs' hearts into human bodies. A man sustained life with full faculty for 12 days and 3 hours. He became known as the Vertical Pig. The track first appeared on the first Kiss FM transmission of '93, making it an early piece from the album's sessions. It later turned up as part of Lifeforms' Path on the Lifeforms VHS release. Cerebral. Despite a somewhat jarring opening with delayed metallic shards, a flute note and odd percussive sounds, Cerebral turns out to be the very much needed respite after Vertical Pig's onslaught. While not as warmly welcoming as something like Domain, it is very much ambient territory again. An acoustic guitar loop leads the way, with other acoustic phrases coming and going throughout. A brief bass guitar motif punctuates the acoustics, and the whole thing is backed by a chopped up and looped vocal from Curve's Tony Halliday. The combination of acoustic guitar, flute, wordless vocals and water samples makes the track read like new age fodder on paper, but the harmonic ambiguity of the piece and the unusual run of samples bursting through at various points keeps that at bay. It's serene but never fully relaxing, odd sounds and unusual note choices keeping the listener on their toes at all times. Discussing the broadness of what electronic music can be in a 1994 interview with The Wire, Garry said, "I'd have no qualms about bringing in a guitar into this environment, for example, or a voice, with Cerebral no doubt in the back of his mind." The vocals are credited as coming from a session with Tony Halliday, although this was simply a tape of voice recordings used rather than them recording in a studio with the Curve singer. The track was one of many from Lifeforms to be premiered on the third Kiss FM transmission. Lifeform ends. Possibly the most interconnected piece on all of Lifeforms, Lifeform Ends grows out of the Tony Halliday vocal from Cerebral, accompanied by deep sub-bass rumbles, synth weeps and percussion. This is followed by what could be described as a major key interpolation of the two main chords from Lifeforms. It's odd that Lifeform Ends is a much brighter sounding piece given its less optimistic title, and then the two-note synth melody from both Lifeforms and Ill Flower drives the piece. There are brief appearances of the odd wobbly percussion sound that closes the album. Incredibly, Brian and Garry then throw in the drums from Papua New Guinea for 8 bars. This first half is a light, breezy piece with plenty of percussion, including tabla from Mercury Award-winning Indian percussionist Talvin Singh, one of the album's increasingly common drum loops made from unrecognisable sounds, a soaring vocal line, possibly from an uncredited Liz Fraser, and a bright melody. It's as fun and upbeat as Lifeforms really gets. Lifeform Ends is a track of 2 halves, however, and 3 minutes in, the entire thing changes to a cacophony of reverse metallic sounds, whooping voices, synth whooshes, previously heard on Dead Skin Cells. The track is practically a Lifeforms best of in itself, and squelching 303s. After an uplifting first half, the closing section is unsettling and surreal. Singh's appearance is an interesting one as it suggests ties with the then burgeoning ethno world music scene, an area the band occasionally dabbled in but largely shied away from. Garry would tell Future Music about this dichotomy in 2014. Real World Records invited us to work with musicians like Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan. I'd have loved to work with them, but we turned that down. As much as I liked what those people were doing, it wasn't for us, it seemed too obvious. Lifeform Ends was never used on any of the band's transmissions, but an alternative version, Lifeforms Path 5, appeared frequently. Vit. Vit, and with it the final side of the 2LP edition of Lifeforms, begins with the longest environment on the record, running to nearly 2 minutes. An aeroplane flies over a number of times, there's more running water, a recurring sound in the album's environments, and gradually a huge number of organic sounds appear. Animal calls, human voices, the usual unidentified squelchy noises, that steam train again. Quite a few elements of the transmission-only environments also appear, briefly making this opening section the closest to those broadcasts as the album comes. 303 squelches gradually build up to another of those mid-tempo lolloping beats that seems to be constructed entirely from non-musical elements. As strings enter, it's clear Vit is going to continue where Lifeform ends left off, in brighter territory. Indeed, the two string chords and the odd sounding synth sequence that comes in later are almost reminiscent of the sort of thing you'd find on dance music of the time. One can easily imagine them on a euphoric Balearic track. The beats are gradually supplemented by percussion loops and a brief appearance of a drum machine. During a brief breakdown, there's a one-off noise that sounds a bit like a duck at 4 minutes 52. It's a strangely whimsical moment from a band whose albums are usually lacking in overt humour. All in all, it's a fun, uplifting track and a world away from the first half of the second disc. Vit follows the mood of the preceding few tracks for me, suggesting an open space populated by wildlife, maybe a savannah. As with a lot of the album, it was first broadcast on the third Kiss FM transmission. The seemingly unusual title is actually the name of a local Thai restaurateur providing the finest noodles in North London. Vit's cafe was located around the corner from Earthbeat in Dollis Hill, and Vit himself would become part of the group's visual presence, appearing in album artwork over the coming years, and even in their later music videos. Omnipresence. One of a run of longer tracks occupying the middle of Lifeforms Disc 2, Omnipresence tones down the brighter mood, temporarily at least, bringing a more subdued atmosphere to proceedings. Much like Illflower before it, the track only appeared on transmissions via its opening environment, first broadcast on the third Kiss FM transmission. The environment is a cavernous space filled with twinkling synths, mournful guitar and echoing bangs. After a minute, the main track arrives with ethnic percussion and a flute previously heard on Cascade Part 5. Indeed, Omnipresence feels much closer to that single's nocturnal aquatic feel than the rest of Lifeforms. The main synth melody that comes in just before 2 minutes is both catchy and wistful. With synth stabs and chords coming in, the track feels almost poppy, certainly by the album standards, and only the restrained beats keep it from being potential single material. A secondary theme using a plucked instrument sample is just as beautiful. For all the weirdness on the album, Omnipresence is a timely reminder that Garry and Brian are just as capable of comparatively straightforward melodic electronic music. Still structurally varied and full of the usual whirs, squelches and other odd sounds associated with the band, it's an all-round beautiful piece and a Lifeforms highlight. The track samples Klaus Schulze's 1991 track Airlight, giving him a co-writing credit on it. Room 208. Room 208 opens with yet another lengthy environment, full of reverse sounds and an old field recording from Brian's early years in Glasgow, also released as Ronken Glen Park from Z-Box 2. It's testament to the pair's sound manipulation skills that a recording of a city park sounds so exotic. Once again, one is reminded of a tribal language being shouted rather than something from 1980s Scotland. No jokes, please. A second, shorter environment follows, featuring more electric guitar. The guitar is a surprisingly common instrument in the band's catalogue, and then the main track gets going. Room 208 is the closest Lifeforms comes to funky, with a groovy bass line and a somewhat danceable beat. The main synth melody is almost whimsically upbeat, and the mood of the album returns to that found on Vit and the first half of Lifeform Ends. The piece itself only lasts around half the track's runtime, with a new plucked melody section taking up the final couple of minutes. It's slightly more melancholic in nature, giving the track, with its two environments and upbeat and downbeat sections, a huge range of images and emotions. The closing environment continues into the following track. One of the earliest tracks to be broadcast from Lifeforms, Room 208 was premiered in May '93 on the second Kiss FM transmission. The title doesn't get a reference in the Lifeforms glossary, but has an entire story to itself which seems to involve a threesome between a Spanish woman, Yage and Pin. Set after the Art Futura show, probably a reference to the 1995 transmission to the Art Futura festival, the story is likely embellished and possibly entirely untruthful. The appearance of the root number at least is at best a coincidence, with the track existing 2 years before the band's appearance at that festival. Elaborate Burn. Elaborate Burn is an unusual track in that it was released in a longer version the previous year as Cascade Part 3. Most of what can be said about the track is in that entry. The main difference, of course, is the opening environment with its striking bird call and 303 squelches. It's only a brief section, but very memorable for that bird call, especially it being followed by a pitched down version. Regardless of its previous release, Elaborate Burn is a much needed breather after a run of heavily rhythmic tracks, acting as an ambient palette cleanser before the album closer. In the context of Lifeforms, the track's brighter moments seem to come to the fore, the mood of the previous track in particular making the listener more receptive to uplifting sounds rather than the colder, darker feel of the Cascade single. The track is cut short, fading away into reverb as the nighttime insects and other organic sounds of Little Brother fade in. Elaborate Burn was the second track from Lifeforms to be broadcast, featuring on the first Kiss FM transmission in early '93. It was a hugely important and influential piece for the band, one that signalled the direction they would take on Lifeforms after some slightly less successful stylistic experiments in '92. The title is described as not as suggested, some reference to wartime burn mutilation, quite simply being burnt or ripped off in business. Only persons on the inside can achieve an elaborate burn, however. Little Brother. If there's one recurring criticism I have of FSOL, it's their choice of album closers. Not that every album should follow a strict structure, but I always feel that an album should end on a suitably memorable track, something that sticks in the memory, be it ending on a bang or a slow drawn out fade away. FSOL's 90s albums don't really do this. Indeed, Little Brother isn't entirely unlike Central Industrial and Pod Room in being uncharacteristically repetitive and rhythm-led. Oh well, you can't have everything. The track opens with Nighttime Insects, suggesting the album closing after a sunset. On top of layers of percussion, there's all sorts in there, is a recurring doom-laden chord. Lifeforms doesn't end on a high, but on an unsettlingly dark note. Perhaps not surprising. Just when you've forgotten about it, the chord comes back in, cutting through the track and chilling the listener. The number of samples that appear in the track is remarkable, with a huge amount of weird noises, animal sounds, squelches, bursts of guitar feedback, even a wobbly synth sound dating back to the 80s, originally recorded as a Z-Box track 7,000 years. It's dense and continually engaging. As the percussion fades into reverb, a short environment appears led by flute. This section was used regularly in the Kiss FM transmissions and 3D Headspace tour as part of a longer environment which would eventually become part of Tired on ISDN. It's a particularly surreal section and ends the album on a really strange note. I've mentioned before how utterly bizarre that last sound is, a note that seems to be comprised of bells and water. It was heard earlier on Lifeform Ends and would of course feature too in Tired. As for the title, all the studio work and fast food resulted in Yage's little brother being born. Turns out sitting around in the studio eating crap makes you fat. The main track itself would first appear on the 1994 Essential Mix with Robert Fripp. If I was making Lifeforms, and that's already a bold and ultimately stupid line of thinking, but here we go, I would put Among Myselves at the end. Not only is it the only track on disc 1 that feels like it would fit with the second disc's more lively organic feel, but its ending, reprising Cascade, would round out the album brilliantly. For the 3 people who are still with me at this point, thank you very much for watching this video. I really appreciate it. I would love to know your thoughts. Lifeforms is such a well-loved and famous album. Throw them at me, give me your interpretations, your stories about hearing this album back in the 90s, everything. I want to read them all. There are also like, subscribe and share buttons you might like to press. And I'll be back very soon rounding up the Lifeforms era with the Lifeforms video, some compilation tracks, the remaining 3D Headspace tour and the Lifeforms Path single. I hope to see you then.